Nobody move. Federal agents, hands where I can see them. Now. This is a private event. You have no jurisdiction here. I want my attorney on the phone immediately. Richard Calloway, you are under arrest. Turn around and place your hands behind your back.
The night I walked into his office building with a USB drive and a federal agent on speed dial, I was 24 years old. 24. Still young enough that people looked at me and saw a girl. Still young enough that when I walked into a room, powerful men looked past me the way they always had, as if I were furniture, or decoration, or simply part of the background of their important lives. That is exactly what saved me. 3 years earlier, I had walked into his life thinking I was the luckiest girl in the world. I had a new ring on my finger that cost more than my mother made in a year. I had a new last name that opened doors I had only ever stood outside of. And I had a very powerful, very dangerous, very deliberate man who had decided, out of every woman in every room he had ever commanded, that he wanted me. I thought that was love. I thought being chosen by someone like him meant something about who I was. About my worth. About where my life was finally going. It wasn't love. It was strategy. And the most terrifying thing I can tell you is that by the time I understood the difference, I was already inside. Already surrounded. Already standing in the middle of something I could not simply walk away from, not without consequences that would reach all the way to the people I loved most. But here is what he never accounted for. Here is the thing that a man like Richard, a man who has spent his entire adult life controlling people, predicting people, deciding in advance what people will and will not do, could simply not compute. He had never met a woman who was willing to be patient. And I was the most patient woman he would ever make the mistake of underestimating. Stay with me. Because what happened inside that marriage, what he built behind closed doors, what he forced on me and on the women around me, what I watched and catalogued and quietly, methodically used against him, it is not a story you have heard before. Not like this. Not from this angle. Not with this ending. And the twist? The moment near the very end of all of this that even I did not see coming. I still think about it. I probably always will. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you aren't subscribed yet, hit that button now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we go back to the beginning, and we are going all the way back, I need you to sit with 3 things. 3 questions that federal investigators, experienced journalists, and the people who had known this man for decades could not answer. 3 questions that haunted this case long before anyone was willing to call it a case at all. Question 1. How does a self-made man worth tens of millions of dollars operate an entire criminal network, not in some dark corner of the country, not in secret basements, but in plain sight, in 3 major American cities, surrounded by lawyers and city officials and charity board members and neighbors who attended his fundraising dinners, for over a decade, without a single arrest? How does a machine that large stay invisible for that long? And more importantly, who helps it stay invisible, and why? Question 2. What exactly happens inside these so-called private clubs? Behind the door codes and the dark-suited men at the entrances and the carefully cultivated air of exclusivity, what actually takes place? And who are the women inside them? Where did they come from? What were they told? And what happened to the ones who tried to leave before Maya came along? And question 3. The one that changes everything. The one that I want you to hold in your mind as we go through every chapter of this story, because when the answer arrives, it will reframe every single thing that came before it. Who helped her bring him down? Because it was not who you would expect. It was not a seasoned investigator, though one of those mattered enormously. It was not a lawyer, though the law eventually caught up. It was not a journalist, though the press played its role in the end. It was someone whose presence in this story makes complete and devastating sense once you understand everything that came before it, and absolutely no sense at all until you do. I promise you, when we get there, you will feel it. Let's go back to where this all began. To a girl who was 20 years old, working a job that started before sunrise, sending money home to a mother who needed it, dreaming of a door that would one day open for her. She just never anticipated what would be standing behind it when it did. Maya grew up in a small city in Georgia, the only child of a woman who worked as a medical receptionist and who raised her with the particular combination of warmth and practicality that belongs to mothers who have never had the luxury of choosing one over the other. Her mother was not a woman who talked about dreams the way people do in movies. She talked about plans. Steps. What comes after what? She was the first person Maya ever learned precision from, and it is not a coincidence that precision would one day save her life. Maya was bright. Everyone who knew her said that. The kind of bright that shows itself not in test scores, though those were fine, but in the way she paid attention. The way she noticed things. A shift in someone's tone. A detail that didn't quite fit. A silence that lasted a half-second too long. She had been absorbing the subtext of rooms her entire life without ever being taught to do it. It was simply how she was built. She started at a state university at 18 on a partial scholarship and part-time job income. She was studying communications and doing well. But in her second year, the financial gap between what she had and what it cost became impossible to bridge. Her mother's health had complicated things. The scholarship money wasn't enough. The loans were already stacking. And so she made the practical decision that millions of young women in this country make every single year and never talk about publicly. She stopped. She moved to a larger city. She found a roommate. She found 2 jobs. The coffee shop. The catering company. She sent $300 home every month without fail, even when that left her with almost nothing. She kept a corkboard above her desk with a savings goal written in marker and magazine photographs of the life she intended to have eventually, when eventually arrived. She was 20 years old, and she was tired in that specific way that comes not from laziness but from effort, from holding up more than one person's weight for longer than anyone that age should have to. And she was kind. That is the thing about Maya that I think gets lost in the telling of what came next. She was genuinely, deeply kind. Not in the soft, passive way that people sometimes mean when they call women kind. In the active way. She noticed when people were struggling. She helped when she could. She believed, because she had been raised by someone who believed it, that most people were fundamentally trying their best. That belief would be weaponized against her. But it was never a weakness. It was part of who she was. And it survived everything that came after. She was working a corporate charity gala in October, black uniform, tray of champagne glasses, moving through a room of people who didn't see her, when Richard walked up to the coat check table where she had been briefly stationed and asked her a question. She doesn't remember exactly what the question was. Something about the event, or the venue, or something she'd said to a colleague that he'd overheard. What she remembers is that after she answered, he asked another question. And then another. And that at no point in that conversation did he look past her, or over her shoulder, or at his phone. He looked at her. The whole time. With the particular quality of attention that feels, when you are 20 years old and invisible to most of the rooms you occupy, like sunlight after a very long winter. His name was Richard Calloway. He was 53 years old. He was silver-haired, which on him looked distinguished rather than old. He was tall, and well-dressed in that specific way that doesn't announce itself, no logos, nothing flashy, everything simply the best available version of itself. He had a voice that was calm and low and used to being listened to, and he spoke to her as though she were not the girl working the coat check but someone he had specifically come to find. She told herself later that she should have recognized it as too perfect. And she is right, in retrospect, it was. A man like Richard does not approach coat check girls at charity galas out of genuine social impulse. Every move he made was calculated. But the calculation was so thorough, so practiced, so precisely calibrated to what she needed and didn't know she needed, that it simply felt real. He came back. That was the part she never quite got over when she finally understood what he was. He came back the following week to an event the catering company was staffing, a corporate dinner on the 42nd floor of a building she had worked in twice before without ever being invited above the lobby. And he brought her coffee. Her specific order. From a place 2 miles away that she had mentioned offhandedly in their conversation the week before, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely. He remembered. He had sent someone to get it. He handed it to her with no performance, no fanfare, as though it were simply a natural and obvious thing to do. That is not romance. That is research. That is a man who has done this before, who knows precisely which gesture lands hardest with precisely which type of woman, and who executes it with the confidence of someone who has never been wrong about this. She didn't know that yet. She just knew that no one had ever remembered a detail like that about her before. And she felt it in the way that you feel sunlight, not as a choice, but as warmth arriving before you've decided whether to turn toward it. He was patient. Extraordinarily, deliberately patient. It took him 4 months to ask her to dinner. 4 full months of showing up at events she was working, of brief and warm conversations, of small and perfectly chosen gestures. He never pushed. He never made her feel obligated. He never gave her any reason to guard herself, because there was always a plausible innocent explanation for everything he did. He was just a man who found her interesting. Who showed up when he said he would. Who listened when she spoke and demonstrated, again and again, that he remembered what she had said. By the time he asked her to dinner, she had already decided she would say yes. She had decided it weeks before he asked. And that, the fact that she was already decided, already leaning, already inside the warmth of his attention without having made a conscious choice to enter it, was exactly what he had been building toward. He took her to dinner at a restaurant she had read about in a magazine and never expected to enter as a guest. He was gracious and unhurried and genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that surprised her. He asked about her mother. He asked about her plans, not dismissively, the way people sometimes ask young women about their plans when they don't actually want the answer, but with the real, interested attention of someone who was prepared to engage with whatever she said. He talked about his own beginnings, which were modest, and about what it had taken to build what he'd built, and he framed all of it in a language of discipline and patience and delayed gratification that resonated with a woman who had been exercising exactly those qualities her entire adult life without anyone ever acknowledging them. He walked her to her car at the end of the night. He said good night at a distance that was respectful. He texted her the following morning, not too early, not too late, to say he'd had a wonderful time and would like to see her again if she was interested. She was interested. Looking back, the seduction was technically perfect. There is no other word for it. He had identified what she needed, safety, visibility, to be someone that a powerful person chose, and he had delivered it so flawlessly and so consistently over such an extended period of time that by the time she was in love with him, the love felt entirely her own. It did not feel like something that had been engineered. It felt like something she had grown herself, from seeds she had chosen, in soil she had prepared. That is the most sophisticated kind of manipulation. The kind that leaves no fingerprints because the victim believes, completely and in good faith, that they made every decision freely. She was 21 when he proposed. A rooftop dinner at a private venue that wasn't open to the public. Candles, flowers, a string quartet she assumed he had arranged for some other purpose until the moment he stood up from the table, reached into his jacket, and got down on one knee. The ring was extraordinary. She noticed the ring the way you notice something that exists in a category you have never previously encountered, not as an object you evaluate but as a fact of the world that simply arrives and changes the shape of everything around it. He said, "You are the first real thing in my life in a very long time. I don't want to spend another year without you in it. Say yes." She said yes. She called her mother that night from the car. She was still crying, the good kind, the overwhelmed kind. Her mother listened to everything she said and then went quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. And then she said, "Maya. Is this what you want? Or is this what he wants?" And Maya said, "Both, Mama. It's both." Her mother said congratulations. She said she loved her. She said she would fly up for the engagement dinner. She said all of the right things in the right order. But Maya had inherited her mother's precision. And she heard the thing her mother did not say. She told herself it was just the age difference. Her mother was traditional. She would come around. She would meet Richard properly and she would see what Maya saw. Her best friend Kezia met the news differently. Kezia, who had known Maya since they were 16, who had lived through every version of Maya that had existed up to this point, Kezia listened to everything, asked 3 careful questions about how Maya felt and what her life would look like and whether she had thought about the specifics, and then hugged her for a long time and said, "I hope you always feel this safe with him." Not, "He sounds wonderful." Not, "I'm so happy for you. I hope you always feel this safe." At 21, Maya heard it as a blessing. As Kezia's way of saying she wanted this to be everything Maya deserved. She was 23, in a locked bathroom in a house she no longer felt she could leave, before she replayed that conversation and finally heard it correctly. Kezia had been telling her to pay attention to the safety. Because safety that is real doesn't need to be hoped for. It simply is. And safety that has to be sustained by someone else's decision, safety that can be revoked, is not safety at all. It is control. Now, let me tell you who Richard was. Not who Maya believed him to be in those early months, and not the cartoon villain it would be convenient to reduce him to, but who he actually was, because understanding him is the only way to understand how he kept what he built invisible for as long as he did. Richard Calloway was 53 years old and genuinely self-made, which was the first and most important thing about him. He had grown up in modest circumstances in the Midwest, the son of a mechanic and a school administrator, and he had built his wealth through a combination of real intelligence, relentless work, and an instinctive understanding of how power moves between people. He read rooms the way other people read books, absorbing everything, retaining what mattered, discarding what didn't. He had built a legitimate and successful real estate business over 2 decades. It was real. The buildings existed. The developments were documented. The business employed people and filed its taxes and operated entirely above board. This was not a front company in the obvious sense. It was a real enterprise that also provided the financial architecture, the professional credibility, and the social connections that made everything else possible. He sat on 2 major charity boards. He had received a commendation from his city's mayor, framed and hanging in the office where Maya would one day find the evidence that destroyed him. He was known. He was liked. He was trusted by people whose trust was not easily given, because he had spent decades earning it with patience and precision and the particular gift of making every person in a room feel seen. He was a widower. His first wife, Catherine, had died of cancer 11 years before he met Maya. He spoke of her rarely and always with a careful, contained grief that read as deeply private and somehow made him more trustworthy rather than less, as though the loss had refined him, stripped away the superficial, left only what mattered. He had 2 children from that marriage. A daughter, Renee, who lived in London and called on birthdays and sent careful, warm messages that maintained the relationship without requiring proximity. And Marcus. Marcus was 32. Richard's only son. And the word that was used about Marcus, in Richard's household, in his social circle, among his staff, was always the same word, estranged. Said quickly and quietly and without elaboration, the way you say a word you have rehearsed to stop anyone from asking follow-up questions. When Maya asked about Marcus in the early months of their relationship, Richard's face did something she noticed and filed away and did not yet know what to do with. It went smooth. Not sad. Not angry. Smooth, the face of a man performing the absence of feeling rather than actually feeling nothing. He said, "Marcus and I have irreconcilable differences. It's a closed chapter. I don't discuss it." She let it go. She was 21 and she was in love, and there are things you let go when you're 21 and in love with a man who has given you every reason to trust him and not yet shown you any reason to question that trust. 6 weeks after their wedding, she noticed the first rule. She was never allowed in his study. Not once. Not for any reason. The door was always closed, and it was always locked, and she had never in the course of their relationship been inside that room for even a moment. She had accepted this the way she had accepted other things about Richard, as a feature of who he was, a privacy she had no reason to violate, a door that simply wasn't hers to open. But 6 weeks into the marriage, she walked past it on her way to the kitchen at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep, and the following morning at breakfast Richard looked up from his newspaper and said, without looking at her, "You were up last night." Not a question. A statement. A signal. She said yes, she'd been thirsty. He nodded and returned to his paper. And she sat across from him and drank her coffee and felt, for the first time, the specific coldness of realizing that the house she was living in was watching her. She told herself it was cameras for security. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being oversensitive. She told herself a lot of things that year. That is what you do when you are inside something that is closing around you slowly, you explain away the walls because the alternative is too frightening to consider. But she remembered. She filed it away. She had always been good at noticing things. For months into the marriage, Richard told Maya he was taking her to a private business dinner. He said it the way he said most things, calmly, with the air of someone accustomed to having their sentences received as settled fact rather than suggestions. He told her what to wear. He told her when to be ready. He told her it was a small gathering of important clients and that her role was simply to be warm and present and pleasant, which she was always good at. She wore what he suggested. She was ready when he said. She sat beside him in the car for 40 minutes without knowing where they were going because the windows were tinted and she had not yet memorized the city well enough to track the route. The building they arrived at had no sign. It was in a part of the city that was expensive but not conspicuous, the kind of block where old money sits behind anonymous facades precisely because it has nothing to prove. There was a door code. There were 2 men at the entrance in dark suits who greeted Richard by name without smiling and looked at Maya the way people look at furniture they have been told to expect. Inside, low lighting. Dark wood paneling that absorbed sound. The kind of quiet that exists in spaces specifically designed to prevent the outside world from entering. Men at tables and in booths, she counted quickly, a habit she had developed without knowing she was developing it, 14 of them, ranging from their mid-40s to their early 70s. Some she recognized from the pages of the business section. One she recognized from a local news segment about city infrastructure funding. 2 she had seen in photographs in Richard's home office, in the visible and unsecured area she was permitted to enter. And moving through the room, women. All of them young. All of them somewhere in their 20s. Dressed identically in black, simple, tailored, a uniform without being an obvious uniform. They moved with a precision that registered as off before she could articulate why. Their movements were practiced. Their expressions were what she would later describe as performed neutral, not the natural ease of someone who is comfortable in a room, but the careful blankness of someone who has learned to keep their face from saying anything that hasn't been approved. Maya smiled for 4 hours. She made pleasant conversation with 2 men whose names she immediately memorized. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Richard's arm when she sensed he wanted her to. She said everything was lovely, the food was wonderful, what a beautiful space. And the entire time, something in the very floor of her stomach, something below the level of conscious thought, something old and animal and precise, was telling her that the women moving through that room were not waitresses. It was telling her that they were there the same way she was there. Not by choice. Not entirely. She didn't name that feeling yet. She put it away. She was not ready for what naming it would require. But she did not forget it. She had never in her life forgotten something her body told her was important. 3 weeks after that dinner, Richard was called away on an emergency. A property dispute, one of his Atlanta developments, a permit issue that had escalated and needed him physically present, he said. He took a call at 6 in the morning that changed his schedule entirely. He was dressed and out of the house by 7:45, moving quickly in the way that powerful men move when something has disrupted their control of a situation and they need to reassert it. His staff was called in to help with the departure. His personal assistant. His driver. Dolores, the housekeeper, who had worked for Richard for 9 years and who was one of the few people in that household whose eyes, when they met Maya's, held something that wasn't performance. And in the organized chaos of that morning, in the movement of bags and calls and schedules being rearranged, Dolores made a mistake she had never made before and would never make again. She left the study door unlocked. Maya discovered it at 10:15 in the morning, after the house had emptied and gone quiet. She was walking past, just walking past, and her hand touched the handle from habit, expecting the familiar resistance of the lock. The handle turned. She stood at that open door for 4 full minutes. She counted them on the clock at the end of the hallway because she needed something concrete to hold on to while the rest of her processed what was in front of her. Then she went in. The room was exactly what you would expect from a man like Richard, ordered, expensive, deliberately impersonal. A large leather-topped desk. Built-in shelving with books arranged by height rather than subject. A safe behind a painting, visible because the painting was slightly ajar from being recently opened. Filing cabinets along one wall, all closed. A desktop computer, locked. And on the desk, a ledger. Open. She looked at it for 30 seconds before she touched it. Then she turned pages. The ledger was coded, initials, numbers, abbreviations she didn't immediately understand. But some things didn't require decoding. The scale of the financial figures was not consistent with any legitimate business she had knowledge of him running. The frequency of entries, all of them cash or cash equivalent, suggested a volume of transactions that existed entirely outside the company structures she had seen in the documents he occasionally discussed in her presence. She found 3 other ledgers in the top drawer of the desk, which was not locked. She found a dark green binder with no label on the shelf behind the desk. She opened it. The first page was a photograph. A young woman, mid-20s, she estimated. Below the photograph, a name in pencil. A city code. A date. A number she couldn't immediately interpret. She turned the page. Another photograph. Another name. Another code. She turned pages for 2 minutes, moving quickly, absorbing faces and the system beneath them. City codes that appeared to correspond to locations. Dates that appeared to be schedules. Numbers that, when she thought about the dinner she had attended 3 weeks ago, began to suggest a meaning she was not ready to fully receive. She found the second phone in the top right drawer, which had been left slightly ajar. She didn't know why the drawer was open. She would wonder about it afterward and conclude that Richard had been in a hurry and less careful than usual. The phone was locked but had preview notifications visible on the screen. She read what she could read without unlocking it. It was enough. It was more than enough. And then she heard it. The particular sound of expensive tires on the gravel of the driveway. The car returning. She had 40 seconds, maybe less. She closed the binder. She closed the ledger to the page it had been on. She replaced everything she had moved to the precise position in which she had found it. She was certain of this because she had photographed the desk with her phone in the first 30 seconds of being in that room, before she touched anything, because some part of her had known, walking through that door, that she might need to leave it exactly as she found it. She walked out of the study. She did not run. Running would have made sound. She walked at a pace that a person walking to the kitchen would walk at, and she pulled the door closed behind her without allowing it to latch loudly, and she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and brought her book to the dining table and opened it to a page somewhere in the middle and sat down. Her hands were completely steady. That surprised her, in the moment. She had expected them to shake. They did not shake. Richard walked through the front door 43 seconds later. The Atlanta situation had resolved faster than expected. He handed his coat to Dolores, who had appeared at the sound of his arrival, and walked through toward the kitchen, and stopped when he saw Maya at the dining table. He said, "How was your morning?" She said, quiet. I made tea. Do you want some? He said no. He went upstairs. He came down 20 minutes later and the study door was closed and locked and he said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, and they had dinner together that evening in the beautiful dining room of the beautiful house and talked about mild things and she smiled when smiling was appropriate and she thought about every single detail of what she had seen with the focused, methodical attention of a person who understands that what they are carrying is extremely fragile and must not be dropped. She understood 3 things by the end of that day. The first was what Richard was. Not a businessman who had made some questionable choices on the margins of a legitimate enterprise. Something much larger and much more deliberate and much more organized than that. The second was that she was inside it. Whether she had chosen to be or not, and she had not, she had been placed there by someone who had selected her for exactly the qualities that would make her useful. She was inside it. She was his wife. Her name was attached to his. Her movements were tracked. Her relationships were known. She could not simply leave. And the third thing she understood was that she had just committed, in that study, to a path that would require everything she had. Because she had gone in. She had seen what she'd seen. And men like Richard did not overlook things like that. She was right. 2 weeks later, he sat across from her at dinner and placed both hands flat on the table. He did not raise his voice. He had, she would come to understand, never in his adult life needed to raise his voice. The voice that never rises is not the voice of a calm person. It is the voice of a person who has so thoroughly established their dominance over a situation that volume would be redundant. He spoke quietly because the quiet said everything the volume would have said, and said it more effectively. He said, "You went into my study." She did not answer. She had already decided, in the 2 weeks between the study and this dinner, that she would not perform surprise or denial. Richard was too intelligent for performances. The only play available to her was a controlled and deliberate stillness. He said, "I want you to understand something about how I operate, Maya. I don't have blind spots. I have never had blind spots. Everything that happens in this house, in my businesses, in the lives of the people connected to me, I know it. I have always known it. This is not a coincidence. This is architecture. I built it deliberately because I learned a long time ago that the cost of not knowing something is always higher than the cost of knowing it. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." And then he told her what he knew about her mother. He told her the address of the house her mother rented. The name of the medical practice where she worked. The name of her mother's primary physician, and the nature of the condition being treated, information that was private, that existed only in medical records, that her mother had asked her not to share even with close friends because she didn't want people worrying. He told her about Kezia. Her apartment building, the floor, the name of her employer and her direct supervisor. And then, quietly, with the careful precision of a man who has reviewed a document many times and knows exactly which part will land hardest, he described Kezia's immigration situation in specific terms that demonstrated he had not just researched it but had already had it evaluated by someone who understood its vulnerabilities. He said, "You are my wife. The life we have together, this house, the stability you have, the security your mother has, all of that exists because of what I have built and how I have chosen to build it. What I do, the specifics of how my businesses operate, the events I ask you to attend, none of that is your concern. What is your concern is being my wife. Being present when I need you present. Being warm and composed and exactly who I married. Do we have an understanding?" He refilled his glass. He said, "I don't believe I need to say anything further." He was right. He didn't. She sat across from him for the rest of that dinner and she ate what was in front of her and she said the things that needed to be said and she performed the version of herself that he had decided she was, agreeable, settled, not a problem, and on the inside, something was happening that he could not see and would not have believed if he could have. She was not breaking. She was deciding. She was running through the architecture of what he had just told her, the reach of it, the deliberateness of it, the years it must have taken to build a position this fortified, and she was measuring it against herself. Against what she had. Against what she could do with what she had. And she was making a decision that was, in that moment, the most important decision she had ever made. She would not run. Running was panic. Running was visible. Running was exactly the response of a person who did not understand what they were up against. She had watched enough of what he did to know that people who panicked around Richard ended up in positions that were worse than the one they were trying to escape. She would not leave. Not yet. Not until leaving was a choice she had the power to make on her own terms rather than a thing that was happening to her. She would stay. And she would watch. And she would learn every single thing that could be learned from inside this house, from inside his world, from the position he had placed her in thinking it would keep her small, and she would use all of it. She was 22 years old when she made that decision. She was 24 when it worked. The following Friday, Richard brought her to his flagship club for the first time. This was different from the dinner. The dinner had been a test, she understood that now. A controlled introduction to the edges of his world, designed to show her something without showing her everything, to gauge her reaction, to determine whether she was the compliant and decorative presence he had selected her to be. She had passed the test. She had smiled and been warm and said everything was lovely and registered nothing she wasn't supposed to register. And so now he brought her further in. The club occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the city's most exclusive district. There was no signage anywhere, not on the building's exterior, not in the elevator, not at the entrance on the 41st floor. There was a keypad and a man at a desk who called Richard by name and looked at Maya with the same furniture-adjacent attention she was becoming accustomed to. Inside, it was beautiful. That was the first and most disorienting thing. It was genuinely, expensively, impeccably beautiful, dark wood and warm light and floral arrangements that cost more than her monthly rent had once cost, music that existed at exactly the right volume to fill the air without interrupting conversation. If you walked in without knowing anything, you would think you had entered a private members' club of the kind that wealthy people pay substantial annual fees to belong to. The kind that has a long wait list and discreet staff and rooms named after deceased philanthropists. It looked like that. It was designed to look like that. The looking like that was part of how it survived. Richard introduced her to several men, first names only, a pattern she recognized immediately and filed away. She was introduced as his wife, which was true, but in the way it was said and the way these men received it she understood she was also being introduced as something else. As a signal. As a demonstration of a particular kind of taste and control. She was the right kind of wife, young, poised, beautiful, and apparently content to be present without understanding. She let them believe that. The women she had seen at the dinner were here too. More of them, she counted 11 on the main floor, moving through the room with the same trained composure she had observed before. She watched them more carefully this time because she could. Because Richard was occupied with his guests and she was expected to float pleasantly and she used that floating to observe everything she could observe without appearing to observe anything at all. She watched the hierarchy. Who gave the women instructions and how those instructions were delivered, a word, a gesture, a look that had meaning she didn't yet have the context to decode but that she registered and stored. She watched which men the women approached and which men they were steered toward and by whom. She watched what happened at the tables in the back of the room that were partially obscured by a decorative partition, and she watched the women who disappeared through a door to the left of those tables, and she watched how long they were gone, and she watched their faces when they came back. She held a glass of champagne for 4 hours and said nothing of value to a single person. And she memorized everything. Every exit. Every entrance, 3 visible, one she was nearly certain was concealed behind a service panel in the corridor leading to what appeared to be a private dining room. The faces of the men she had not been introduced to. The face of the man who appeared to function as an operational manager, not Richard, not a guest, but someone in between who moved through the space with authority and purpose and who the staff oriented toward when they needed direction. His name, she would later confirm, was Preston. She filed Preston away with everything else. That night, in the marble bathroom of the private suite where Richard hosted a small late dinner for 3 of his most senior clients, she excused herself and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub for 3 minutes. She was not falling apart. She was thinking. She was thinking about what she had seen, and what it meant, and what it would take to turn it into something that could move a wall that had been standing for a very long time. She was thinking about the women in the green binder. She was thinking about Kezia. She was thinking about her mother's address, sent back to her by a man who had researched her family before marrying her. She was thinking about what she needed and how far away she currently was from having it. Then she unlocked the bathroom door and went back to the dinner and smiled for another 90 minutes and was exactly who Richard needed her to be. She had bought a second phone 3 weeks earlier. Cash, from a gas station in a town 40 minutes away. She had driven there in the window of a solo errand run. Richard permitted her a small and specific freedom of movement, monitored, which she had studied carefully before using. She had paid cash. She had left her car a street away from the gas station and walked. She had not yet used the phone for anything except research. That night, in the car home while Richard took a call in the front seat and the privacy partition was up, she opened the phone and began to make a list. Here is what Maya did not have. She did not have money of her own. Richard controlled every account, every card, every financial mechanism in their shared life with a completeness that she had initially mistaken for generosity and now understood as architecture. He gave her an allowance, which was generous in amount and total in its tracking. She knew because she had tested it once, early on, withdrawing slightly more than usual for a fabricated purpose, and he had mentioned it at dinner that evening in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely clear. She did not have a law degree, or a contact at a law firm, or any professional relationship with anyone in a position to help her that Richard had not either introduced her to or vetted. She did not have freedom of movement beyond the specific and monitored windows he permitted. She did not have access to any communication channel that she was confident he could not see, except the burner phone, and she used it with the specific discipline of someone who understands that its discovery would end everything. She did not have time to be impatient. Here is what she did have. She had a memory that functioned, under pressure, with a photographic precision she had always possessed but never previously needed in a high-stakes context. She had spent 20 years absorbing details from rooms she wasn't supposed to matter in, and that practice had made her exceptional at it. She had the discipline of someone who had learned early that wanting something is not enough, that the distance between wanting and having is always paved with unglamorous, unseen, uncelebrated work. And she had something else. Something that Richard, in all his calculation, had failed to account for. She had the absolute, settled, unshakable knowledge of who she was underneath the performance he had decided she was. She knew what she was capable of. She had always known, even when the rooms she moved through didn't. And she had been in rooms that didn't know what she was capable of her entire life, and she had learned to find that useful rather than demoralizing. She began building her archive in the month after the first club visit. She attended every event Richard brought her to, the dinners, the club evenings, the private gatherings at his home for clients she now understood were not simply business contacts but participants in a system. She moved through all of it with the same composed, pleasant, entirely disarming presence she had been performing for months. And she watched and listened and retained with a completeness that nobody in that room would have considered possible from the woman Richard had positioned as decorative. Financial patterns, pieced together from overheard conversations. Names, clients, first names, sometimes last names she could connect to faces she had seen in the business press. Names of the women, gathered carefully from moments of proximity, a hallway, a powder room, a coat room where she had once managed to exchange 12 quiet words with a woman named Simone who had looked at her like she was the first person in 2 years who had looked at her like a person. She photographed documents. She did this during the brief, infrequent windows when the study was accessible, maintenance visits, Richard's own rare absences from the floor, moving quickly, replacing everything with precision, transferring images to an encrypted folder on the burner phone before deleting them from her personal device. She went back and looked at those images during her sanctioned alone time, in the bath, with the phone angled away from any possible line of sight she had mapped, and she built from them a picture of the financial structure that was incomplete but growing. She built a coded journal. A system she developed herself over the course of 2 weeks, based on a substitution cipher she had read about once in a book on the history of espionage and had never expected to use. She recorded dates and names and figures and observations in a notebook hidden inside the hollowed-out interior of a novel on the third shelf of the library. A book she had confirmed, on 3 separate occasions using excuses she had engineered, that Richard had never opened and had no apparent awareness of. She began to understand the scope of what she was inside. The operation ran, as best she could piece together, across 3 cities, the one they lived in, a coastal city 4 hours north, and a city further south that appeared from the coded references to be the largest of the 3 operations. The clubs were the visible layer, the part that members accessed and paid for. But beneath the clubs was something more organized and more deliberate and far more harmful than an exclusive private venue. The women were not employees in any legal or practical sense. They had been recruited through a pipeline Maya could only partially see, agencies, promises, debts that were manufactured or real and then used. They were rotated between locations on schedules that appeared in the ledgers. They were managed by people who answered to Preston who answered to Richard. 14 women, from what she could count across the documentation she'd seen. Probably more. She thought about the binder. The names written in pencil. The column of city codes and dates. She built her archive and she thought about the women in the binder and she understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her chest and never moved, that this was not something she could afford to get wrong. She also understood that she could not do it alone. She had reached that conclusion independently, before the night Marcus walked into the club. She had been thinking carefully about the categories of person she might be able to approach. Law enforcement was not off the table but required specific handling. If Richard had the reach she believed he had, a report to a local precinct or even a field office carried risks she couldn't calculate without more information. A journalist required evidence she didn't yet have in a form that could be published. A lawyer required money she didn't control. She was working through the problem in the methodical, unsentimental way she had learned to work through problems when the club's quarterly event brought her face to face with the person she had least expected. Marcus Calloway was 32 years old. He was taller than his father, with his father's good bone structure but none of his father's cultivated stillness. He arrived at the club on a Thursday evening making noise, loud, slightly belligerent, dropping his father's name at the entrance in a way that was either the behavior of a drunk man who felt entitled to his father's spaces or something else entirely. Maya, from across the room, watched his eyes. They were completely clear. She had worked enough events, observed enough actual drunk people, to know what intoxication looked like in someone's eyes regardless of what their behavior suggested. Marcus's eyes were sharp and deliberate and moving through the room with the organized attention of someone who was doing exactly what she was doing on every other evening she spent in that space. He was performing. She took her time. She let the scene with the staff play out. She watched Richard emerge from the private meeting room in the back with the specific tight displeasure of a man who does not appreciate having his carefully maintained environments disrupted, and she watched Marcus play the scene with him, loud and demanding and not quite coherent, and she watched Richard have him escorted out, and she watched the room settle back into its performance of normalcy. And then she excused herself. She found Marcus in the service alley at the building's rear, the one she had identified on her third visit as a camera blind spot and had since used for 2 quiet phone calls on the burner. He was there as though he had known she would come, which she realized later meant he had been watching her too. They stood 3 feet apart in the alley and neither of them performed anything. He said, "You're not what I expected him to have picked." She said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Someone easier to control." She said nothing. She looked at him steadily. He said, "I've been working on this for 2 years. I have financial records, partial client documentation, one former employee who recanted under pressure before I could get anything formal in place. I have enough to know the shape of it but not enough to move on it. The interior is the problem. Everything that would make this irrefutable is inside that building and I have no legitimate way to access it. He looked at her. He said, "You're already inside." He handed her nothing. He gave her no contact information. He did not suggest a plan. He simply said, as he turned back toward the service door, "Don't do it alone." The door closed behind him. She stood in the alley for 90 seconds, thinking. Then she went back inside and found Richard and touched his arm at the right moment and said the right things for the rest of the evening. She went home that night and lay in the dark beside Richard, who slept as he always slept, completely and immediately, the way people sleep when they feel entirely secure in their world, and she thought for a very long time about Marcus Calloway and what his presence in that alley meant and what the 2 years he had described might have produced and who he might know that she did not. She thought one word, over and over, like a stone she was turning in her hands to learn its weight. Soon. The following weeks were the most dangerous she had experienced since walking into the study. Not because Richard discovered anything, he did not, but because the operation of building something under the nose of a man as observant as Richard, inside a house as surveilled as his, while maintaining the performance of a woman who had settled comfortably into her role, required a level of sustained, flawless execution that left no margin at all. There were 3 moments when the margin came close to closing entirely. The first was Preston. Preston had been watching her for some time, she had been aware of it for weeks, a low-level awareness she had not yet acted on because she had no confirmation of what it was. He was Richard's operational second, the man who ran the mechanics of the club so that Richard could maintain the distance of a legitimate businessman from the specifics of the operation. He was careful and experienced and not easily deceived. At a private client dinner in early spring, he seated himself next to her for a portion of the evening and made conversation that was, on its surface, perfectly ordinary. He complimented her composure. He said she seemed to have settled in well. He said Richard was clearly very happy with her. And then he said, quietly, very close, "I'm not sure you're quite as settled as you seem." She smiled. She said that marriage took adjustment for everyone and she was finding her footing. She asked him a question about his role in Richard's businesses that was just detailed enough to suggest she had been paying attention in the way a curious wife pays attention, rather than the way an investigator pays attention. He answered. He moved on. 2 days later he asked her, through a member of the household staff who delivered the request as though it were routine, to take on a specific role at the following week's club event. A role that would place her in proximity to the private rooms. A role that was, she understood immediately, a test of whether she would comply with what he was asking, and that would compromise the distance she had carefully maintained from the operation's interior. She went. She performed the role as requested. She took careful, thorough note of everything she saw in those rooms. She came home and wrote it down from memory with the shower running. The second close call was the journal. Dolores was reorganizing the library on a Tuesday in March. Maya came home from a permitted grocery run to find her standing before the third shelf with an armful of books, sorting by height because Richard had, apparently, made a comment about the arrangement. The novel with the hollowed interior was still on the shelf. It had been moved 4 inches to the left. Maya brought Dolores coffee, complimented her work, asked about her daughter's school situation, and waited. When the house was quiet, she retrieved the journal. She read every entry. She carried it to the guest room fireplace, which she never used and which would not be checked, and she burned every page individually with the methodical patience of someone who understands that speed is the enemy of thoroughness. She rebuilt the entire archive from memory over the following 3 nights, using time she carved out from sleep she could not afford to lose, in a new code, in a new hiding place, in a second copy she kept in a different location she will not disclose to this day. The third close call was Marcus going dark. For 23 days he made no contact and gave no indication of his location or intentions. And a rumor reached Maya through Delphine, in one of the careful, brief exchanges they had learned to conduct in the specific windows the club's layout permitted, that someone in Richard's network had located Marcus and made him a very substantial offer to leave the city permanently. That he had taken it. For 3 days Maya operated under the full working assumption that she was completely, entirely, irreversibly alone. It was during those 3 days that she found the second ledger. It was in a location she had not previously accessed, behind a loose panel in the back of a closet in the private suite at the club, a location she discovered because she had spent 18 months paying attention to every panel and surface and seam in that building, and she had noticed, on her last visit, that one particular section of the closet wall did not sit quite flush. She had 40 seconds alone in that room. She used them completely. The second ledger was similar to the first but covered a different portion of the operation, specifically the intake records for the women. Names, ages, cities of origin, the contact through which they had been recruited, the date of their first appearance in the rotation. She photographed every page. Sitting in the locked bathroom of her own home that evening, looking at those photographs, she found herself stopped on a specific entry. A name. An age, 19. A city she recognized as being 2 hours from the town where she had grown up. She sat with that for a long time. And something that had already been decided inside her was decided again, more completely, with no remaining ambiguity. This was not her story anymore. It had not been just her story for quite some time. The only question that remained was what she was going to do with everything she had accumulated and how she was going to find the people who could help her do it in a way that actually held. Marcus reappeared. He had not taken the money. He had taken the meeting, identified from it 3 additional figures in the network who hadn't appeared on anyone's existing documentation, and used the information to establish a contact he had been working toward for 8 months. He found her in the parking structure 2 blocks from the house on a Tuesday evening when she had a legitimate errand window. He was there for 4 minutes. He handed her a receipt folded into quarters. On it, a name and a contact code. The name belonged to a Department of Justice investigator. Her name was Special Agent Patricia Okonkwo. She had been building a case against Richard Calloway's operation for 2 years, quietly, from the outside, without sufficient interior documentation to move. She had financial structures. She had a former employee whose recantation she had documented and whose recantation itself was, in her assessment, additional evidence. She had pattern analysis and expert testimony on the financial mechanisms. She needed 2 things she had not been able to obtain: direct evidence of the exploitation from inside the operation, and audio documentation of Richard or Preston discussing the operation explicitly. The 3 of them met once in person. Maya drove to the meeting using her legitimate errand window and a route she had mapped carefully on paper, which she destroyed afterward. The diner was 40 miles from the city, chosen by Agent Okonkwo. Maya and Marcus arrived separately. They sat for 90 minutes. The booth was in the corner. Nobody ordered anything hot because nobody had any appetite. Agent Okonkwo was what Maya had hoped for and slightly feared: precise, direct, and entirely without false warmth. She laid out exactly what she needed and exactly what she could and could not offer in return. She said, "I cannot protect you inside that house before we move. I want to be absolutely transparent about that. The moment we have what we need, I will move as fast as is operationally possible. But until that moment, my ability to reach you is limited." She said, "What you are being asked to carry, inside that environment, is significant. I don't want you to underestimate that." Maya said, "I understand." She did. She had been carrying it for 14 months already. She had 11 days from that meeting to gather the final pieces Agent Okonkwo had specified. She went back into that house and that club and that world with the same composed presence she had maintained for 18 months, and she gathered them. On the 11th morning, Richard looked up from his coffee and said, "I think someone in my circle has been speaking to people they shouldn't be speaking to." He was looking at her when he said it. She said, "That sounds worrying. Do you know who?" He said, "Not yet." She said, "I'm sure you'll find out." He said, "I always do." She poured more coffee and agreed that he did. The night of the operation was a Friday. Richard's biggest annual event, the one he planned for 4 months in advance, the one that brought in clients from all 3 cities and the senior membership of the full network. 38 confirmed attendees. A private dinner. A quartet hired from the symphony. The kind of evening that required the full performance of everything the operation presented itself as: legitimate, exclusive, refined, a world apart. Delphine was inside. She had agreed to wear a recording device 3 weeks before the operation date, in a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and took place entirely through a sequence of notes passed inside a folded program at a club event. She had said yes in the second minute. The 2 minutes after that were her deciding not to take it back. Marcus was in a vehicle 2 blocks away with 2 members of Agent Okonkwo's field team. Agent Okonkwo herself was coordinating from a mobile command position with simultaneous teams positioned at the 3 other target locations: the satellite venue, Preston's private residence, the financial access point that had been frozen 48 hours prior without Richard's knowledge. Maya arrived with Richard at 8 o'clock wearing a dress he had selected and a wire she had fitted herself in the guest bathroom at 4:30 that afternoon, in complete silence, with a precision that she attributes to the fact that fear, for her, had long since converted itself into something more useful. The first 40 minutes were the most dangerous. Preston ordered a sweep, routine, he said, pre-event protocol, but it was happening 40 minutes earlier than his established pattern, which meant the external team was not yet fully staged. Maya needed 7 minutes. She created them by approaching Preston with a concern about the seating arrangements, fabricated, detailed, delivered with the anxious warmth of a woman who wants her husband's event to be perfect, and giving him enough specifics to engage with that he spent those 7 minutes with her rather than managing the sweep timing. When she rejoined Richard, he squeezed her hand and told her everything looked beautiful. She thanked him. Delphine came close to breaking at 10:15. Maya saw it happen from 20 feet away, the specific physical signature of someone whose nerve is failing, that particular quality of stillness that is not composure but its opposite. She crossed the room. She put her hand on Delphine's arm. She said 3 words. Delphine breathed. She straightened. She went back to work. At 9:47, Richard drew Maya away from the main floor into a private alcove and poured her a drink. He was in the specific mood that large successful evenings put him in, expansive, satisfied, the mood of a man surveying something he has built and finding it exactly as he intended. He said, "Someone has been speaking to federal investigators. One of my people, I don't know which one yet. I will know within the week." He looked at her over his glass. He said, "I want you to know that none of it will reach me. It never does. I've been building for 30 years, Maya. What I've built cannot be touched." She looked back at him with everything she had. All 18 months of accumulated clarity. All the patience. All the precise, documented, irreversible evidence she had carried out of his world in the only vessel she had available to carry it, her own memory, her own body, the hollowed-out interior of a library book he had never touched. She smiled. She said, "I know." She meant, "I know what you believe. I know it completely. And I know that in 11 minutes, when that door opens, you are going to understand for the first time in your life what it feels like to have been wrong." At 10:17 p.m., Patricia Okonkwo gave the order. It reached 4 teams simultaneously. The satellite venue in the coastal city. The private residence where Preston was hosting 3 clients in a back room. The offshore account access structure that had been frozen 2 days prior, the freeze timed specifically so that it would not trigger Richard's attention before this evening. And the flagship club on the 41st floor of a building in the city's most expensive district, where 38 men were midway through a private dinner and Richard Calloway was standing to make a toast. The agents entered through the front, the service corridor, and the rear loading access. That last one, the concealed entrance behind the service panel in the building's back corridor, had been identified by Maya 18 months earlier, confirmed on repeated visits, and communicated to Marcus in a handwritten note folded inside the spine of a paperback novel she had left on a coffee shop table he passed every Tuesday morning on a route she had identified from a reference he made once, in a 4-minute alley conversation, without realizing she would retain it. She had retained everything. Richard was mid-sentence when the doors opened. He was standing, glass raised, facing a room full of men who had built their sense of safety on the assumption that his protection extended to them as reliably as it extended to himself. He was saying something about the year ahead. About what they had built together. About what was possible for people who understood how the world actually worked. The room changed in the space of a breath. She watched it change from 12 feet away, from exactly the spot where she had positioned herself 20 minutes earlier when she understood from the timing signals Marcus had arranged that the window was approaching. She had not moved from that spot. She would not move from that spot. Richard turned toward the entrance and took in what was happening with the specific speed of a man whose mind has always processed threat quickly. His face moved through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds, confusion, calculation, and then something she had never seen on him before. And then he looked across the room. He looked across the room because he needed, in that moment, to find the one variable in his world that he had assessed most recently and most confidently. He needed to find her face. To confirm that she was where he expected her to be, composed, slightly frightened, his. She was where he expected her to be. She was composed. She was not frightened. And she was not his. She had not been his since the night she walked into his study. She had simply been very patient about letting him believe she was. She held his gaze and she did not look away and she did not perform anything. She simply let him see her. All of her. The version of herself that had existed, clear-eyed and purposeful and completely intact, behind every smile and every pleasant dinner and every performance of the woman he had decided she was. She watched him understand. She watched it move across his face, the full, irreversible comprehension of what had happened, and who had made it happen, and how long it had been in motion while he had been looking at her and seeing furniture. And then the agents reached him, and she looked away, because she had seen what she needed to see and the rest was not for her, the rest was procedure and documentation and the long, grinding mechanism of a justice system doing what it is built to do, slowly, with the complete weight of its authority. She stood still in the center of the room until an agent she had been briefed to identify by a specific badge number reached her and indicated it was time to leave. She picked up her bag. She walked out. The full scope of what Richard had built took weeks to fully document. 14 women identified and removed from active exploitation across the 3-city network. Their ages ranged from 19 to 28. Several had been inside the operation for more than 2 years. Each of them had a history that was individually different and collectively identical in its architecture, a contact, a promise, a debt real or manufactured, a door that opened and then stopped opening from the inside. 9 shell companies dissolved across 4 states. Combined financial assets exceeding $8 million, organized into a structure that the forensic accountants assigned to the case described as among the more sophisticated concealment mechanisms they had encountered in a private exploitation case, sophisticated in the specific sense of being designed to survive scrutiny rather than avoid it, built on the assumption that scrutiny would eventually come. A client list containing 83 names was delivered to the federal prosecution team. The names included 2 city officials, one of whom had publicly chaired a committee on community safety. A state legislator. A federal contractor with active government clearances. And men whose names appeared on the advisory boards of 3 separate charitable foundations, including one dedicated specifically to supporting vulnerable youth. Preston was arrested at his residence at 6:40 in the morning. He did not resist. The agents who made the arrest reported that he appeared to have been awake and dressed before they arrived, which suggested he had known this morning was coming for longer than the 48 hours they had been in final position. He was the specific kind of man who had always known what he was doing would eventually cost him everything, and had made a decision somewhere in the middle of it to keep doing it anyway, and had been paying that bill in installments of dread ever since. Maya's documentation, the 18 months of photographs, the coded records she had rebuilt from memory after the journal burning, and the audio from the wire she had worn the night of the operation, which included Richard's words in the alcove about his untouchability, was described by Agent Okonkwo in her formal post-arrest briefing as the most methodically compiled and internally consistent interior documentation she had encountered in 14 years of federal investigative work. The defense team's pretrial strategy rested on three pillars: that Richard had no direct knowledge of the specific activities conducted at the club level and had delegated operations entirely to Preston, that the financial records reflected legitimate if complex business structures, and that Maya had been a willing and knowing participant in the operation rather than a coerced and surveilled witness to it. They put this argument before a jury that had already heard Agent Okonkwo's testimony about the specific, detailed, documented coercion Richard had applied to ensure Maya's compliance, including the evidence from her testimony about what he had said to her at that dinner table, which was corroborated by a recording on the burner phone that she had made in the hallway immediately after leaving the dining room that evening, pressing record on her way out of the room and leaving the phone running in her coat pocket until she reached the bathroom and turned it off. She had recorded it. She had recorded it 2 weeks into their marriage and had kept that recording for 18 months without telling anyone about it, because she had understood from the moment she walked out of that dining room that what he had said in it was the foundation of everything, and a foundation had to be preserved with absolute care. The defense team did not know about that recording until she disclosed it to the prosecution team in preparation for trial. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Richard's legal team was among the most expensive available and among the most skilled. They cross-examined every witness with sustained, methodical pressure. They attacked the credibility of Delphine's testimony over 3 full days, questioning the consistency of her accounts, suggesting personal motivation, presenting an alternative narrative of her role in the operation that was technically coherent and entirely false. They questioned the chain of custody of Maya's documentation with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it had found anything. It found nothing. Because she had documented every step of her own documentation process. She had recorded, on the second burner phone, the time and date of every photograph she took and the conditions under which she took it. She had maintained, in the rebuilt journal, a record of her own methods alongside the evidence itself. She had built the case the way a contractor builds a structure that will be inspected, with the assumption that scrutiny was coming and with a determination to give that scrutiny nothing to work with. On the morning of day 4, she took the stand. She was cross-examined for 4 hours. Richard's lead attorney was skilled and disciplined and worked hard to find a crack in her testimony. He asked about her compliance. He asked about her attendance at club events. He asked whether she had ever been physically prevented from leaving the property. He asked whether she had ever contacted law enforcement directly. She answered every question. She answered it completely and without hesitation because she had been preparing her answers for 18 months and because there was no answer in her possession that could damage what had been built. When the attorney asked why, if she had been living under coercion, she had never sought outside help earlier, she said, because the nature of the coercion was specifically designed to make outside help dangerous. He told me what he knew about the people I would have turned to. He made it clear that the cost of those contacts would fall on them rather than on me. I spent 18 months building a path toward outside help that would not endanger anyone I loved in the process. That path existed. I used it. The attorney moved on. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury foreperson stood. 21 counts. Guilty. Human trafficking in the first degree. Coercion. Racketeering. Sexual exploitation of a vulnerable person. Conspiracy. Money laundering. And 8 additional counts that the prosecutor read into the record of a courtroom in which every person present was completely still. Maya was seated at the witness table. Her hands were flat on its surface. She had decided, in the weeks leading up to this morning, that she would not perform any particular emotion in this room. Not relief. Not grief. Not satisfaction. She had given enough of herself inside his world and she was not going to give him a single additional thing, including whatever watching her face in this moment might have given him. She was going to be present and composed and entirely herself, which is what she had been working toward since the night she stood at that unlocked door and walked through it. The room reacted around her. She sat still. When it was fully over, when the procedural conclusion of the morning had completed itself, she picked up her bag and she walked out through the courtroom doors into a hallway that was full of people and cameras and noise, and she kept walking through all of it until she reached a service exit at the building's rear that her attorney had identified for her in advance, and she pushed through it into the quiet of an ordinary afternoon. And she stood there for a moment alone, and she breathed. The verdict was not the end. 3 months after it was delivered, a forensic financial team working through the full seizure of Richard Calloway's assets made a discovery that had not appeared anywhere in the prosecution's case file. The Hargrove Community Trust was a charitable foundation, registered 6 years before Maya met Richard, named after his first wife, Catherine Hargrove Calloway. On paper it was a model of philanthropic legitimacy. It had filed correctly every year since its registration. It had distributed real money, carefully calibrated amounts, enough to be credible without being large enough to attract the scrutiny that significant charitable assets attract, to real organizations in the areas of arts education and community development. It had a professional website, a board of named advisors, a mission statement. It had been audited twice. What it also had, invisible beneath the charitable filing structure, was a reserve of $3,800,000 that had been routed there incrementally over 8 years through a series of transactions structured to appear as routine philanthropic contributions from affiliated entities. Not a slush fund in the crude sense, something far more sophisticated. A long-game asset, built by a man who had always operated on the assumption that even the best-constructed systems eventually face challenge, and that a man with real foresight ensures that his own survival is not contingent on the system surviving intact. If the operation fell, and Richard had, clearly, always understood this as a possibility, the Hargrove Trust was what he would live on. Behind the face of a charitable organization that no one had reason to look at closely, behind the name of a woman who could not object to how her memory was being used, sat nearly $4 million that would have been waiting for him on the other side of whatever outcome the legal system delivered. His lead attorney, a man named Gerald Finch, had known about the trust for 5 years. He had, in the course of those 5 years, provided substantive assistance in its construction. When the forensic team's findings were disclosed and the implications became clear, Finch's office issued a statement characterizing the trust as a misunderstanding related to complex philanthropic structuring and indicated that his client intended to cooperate fully with any supplementary inquiry. They were already too late. By the time that statement was issued, the supplementary inquiry had been open for 6 hours. Here is what no one in the investigation had known. Here is the thing that Maya had not disclosed to Agent Okonkwo, or to Marcus, or to the prosecution team, or to anyone, in the 18 months of building what she built and the 8 months of working with law enforcement to bring it to the evening in that club. She had known about the Hargrove Trust for 14 months. She had found it in a transfer slip in one of the study photograph sessions, a name, a foundation identifier, a transaction reference she hadn't recognized at the time but had written down in the journal and returned to. She had spent 6 weeks after finding it confirming what it was, using research she conducted in 30-minute windows on the burner phone at the library during her permitted solo errand times. She had confirmed it. She had understood it. She had photographed the documentation. And she had not given it to anyone. Not out of distrust. Not out of any doubt about the path she was on or the people she was on it with. She had held it because she had spent 18 months living inside the mind of a man who controlled everything through the precise management of information, who had built an empire on the principle that the person who knows the most and discloses it strategically is the person who remains in control regardless of what happens around them, and she had learned that lesson with a thoroughness that he would never have intended and could never have anticipated. She held the trust because she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has been inside a machine and watched all of its parts, that a man like Richard builds redundancy into everything. That the visible operation is never the whole operation. That the thing that everyone is focused on is never the last thing. And that if she handed everything she had to the investigation all at once, and the investigation moved on the visible things and the visible things alone, there would be something left standing in the aftermath. There was always something left standing. She wanted to find it first. She released the trust documentation on a Thursday morning, 4 months after the verdict. She released it not to Agent Okonkwo and not to the prosecution team. She released it to a journalist, a woman named Diane Achebe at a national outlet whose work Maya had read carefully for 8 months and whose reporting discipline and source protection practices she had assessed through methods she declines to describe. She gave Achebe the documentation with the specific request that she give the DOJ a 12-hour window after publication to open the supplementary inquiry before publishing any further details. Achebe agreed. The story ran at 6 in the morning. By 6 in the evening, the DOJ had opened the inquiry. By the following Monday, Gerald Finch was under active investigation for obstruction, conspiracy, and a list of specific legal violations that the Bar Association would take an additional 3 months to fully enumerate. The trust was dissolved. $3,800,000 was seized and ultimately directed, through a legal settlement process that took 14 months, to a victim compensation fund that Maya's attorneys negotiated as a condition of her cooperation with the supplementary proceedings. A second wave of arrests reached 3 men who had served as nominal board members of the trust and had received, in that capacity, financial benefits that the forensic team was able to connect directly to the operations proceeds. None of them had believed their involvement was visible. It had been visible the entire time. Maya had documented it 14 months before anyone else was looking at it. Richard Calloway filed his first appeal from his cell within 30 days of the supplementary verdict. He filed 5 more in the following 18 months. All 6 were denied. The 6th, which reached the circuit court level, was dismissed in a written opinion that was, by the standards of legal language, unusually pointed about the thoroughness of the original prosecution's case and the absence of any procedural basis for reconsideration. His net worth, once estimated at between $30 and $40 million, is for all legal and practical purposes 0. He is serving 34 years. Now let me tell you where everyone ended up. Not because endings are simple, they never are. Not when what happened was this large and this long and touched this many lives, but because you have sat with this story for a long time and you deserve to know what the morning after looks like. Delphine left the city 2 weeks after the trial and moved to a place she chose entirely for herself, which was the first time in 4 years she had chosen anything that way. She works now with an organization dedicated to survivor advocacy, in a role she has asked not to be specified publicly. She testified before a Senate subcommittee on exploitation in the private hospitality sector in the year following the trial. Her testimony was described by 3 of the subcommittee members as among the most substantive and detailed they had received on the subject. She told me, the last time we spoke, that she thinks about them every day. The women she knew inside the network. The ones who are still unreachable. The ones who came before her, whose names she knows but whose stories she doesn't. She thinks about the specific shape of the silence that existed in that building between the women, the way they learned not to look at each other for too long because looking created connection and connection created something that could be used against you. She is working on making the world require less of that kind of silence from people who have never deserved to carry it. Marcus gave one interview, 3 months after the supplementary verdict, to a reporter he had agreed to speak with on specific conditions that included no photographs and no real name. In it he said very little about the personal history and a great deal about the structural failures that allowed what his father built to remain invisible for a decade. He has since declined all further media contact. He lives, as far as anyone who knows him is willing to say, quietly and with some degree of peace. He did something that required an enormous and sustained courage across an enormous and largely invisible span of time. He did it without certainty that it would work and without guarantee of anything except the cost of doing it. It worked. Special Agent Patricia Okonkwo received a formal commendation from the Attorney General's office. She was subsequently appointed to lead the first federally resourced national task force specifically dedicated to private exploitation networks operating within the hospitality and entertainment sectors, a task force that did not previously exist and the creation of which required, as Agent Okonkwo has said in several public addresses since, the kind of case that makes the argument for why the resource is necessary. The investigators who staff that task force refer to it, informally, by a name. I will let you decide what name makes sense. And Maya. She stood outside a service exit on an ordinary afternoon in late spring with her hand on a metal door that had just closed behind her, and she breathed the outside air for the first time in what felt like a very long time without the specific weight of what she was carrying pressing on every breath. Then she went to work. The civil settlement was negotiated over 14 months. The amount is not something she has disclosed publicly, and it is not something I am going to disclose here, because it is not the point, and she has specifically asked that it not be. What she did with it is the point. She built a crisis resource center. A physical building, not a hotline number, not a website, a building with a door that opens from both sides, in the city where Richard's flagship club had operated, for blocks from where that building stands. The center provides legal advocacy, safety planning, financial literacy resources, and a case management program for women in coercive relationships of every kind. It is staffed by people who have been specifically trained and who are specifically paid for the full scope of what they do, because one of the first things Maya did when she understood the scope of the work was identify every place where volunteer goodwill was being substituted for funded infrastructure and correct it. She established a legal defense fund that has, in the 4 years since its founding, provided representation to more than 200 women in coercive or traffic situations who could not have otherwise accessed legal support. She built a mentorship program connecting women who are leaving exploitation situations with women who have walked an earlier version of the same path, not to provide therapy, for which there are specific professionals, but to provide the specific knowledge that comes only from having navigated a road personally and knowing, from the inside, which parts of it are survivable. And a hotline. 24 hours. Not automated. Staffed by human beings who answer and who follow up and who treat every call as the thing it is, someone at a crossroads in the middle of something, reaching toward a door that they cannot yet see clearly, needing to know that on the other side of the door there is something worth walking toward. People ask me if I'm angry. I understand the question. They want to know where I put what was done to me, and what was done to the women around me, and what was done to every person who was used to build a world that served one man's ambition and protected it from consequences for a decade. They want to know if I hold it, or if I set it down somewhere, or if I transformed it into something else. The honest answer is that I don't think those are the only options available, and I think the pressure to choose among them is one of the things we get wrong about what survival requires. I carry it. I am not going to pretend I don't carry it, because the people it happen to deserve honesty more than they deserve the performance of a woman who has completed her grief on a convenient timeline and can now speak about it from a place of clean resolution. It happened. The shape of it is in me. Some mornings I feel the shape of it more than others. I also have work to do. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the second one does not require the first one to be finished or resolved or neatly integrated. The work is not a substitute for the wait. It is simply what I do with the time I have, because the time I have is real and the need is real, and I am the person who can see the specific shape of the problem with a clarity that most people don't have, because I was inside it. He thought he was taking something from me. He was giving me the most comprehensive education in the architecture of what he built that anyone has ever received. He was showing me, from the inside, with complete and involuntary detail, exactly how it was constructed and exactly where its weight was carried and exactly what would need to be removed for it to fall. He showed me the blueprint because he thought I was decoration. Because he thought the person carrying the trays in the room doesn't remember what she sees. I remembered everything. I want to say one last thing, and I want to say it without softening it for palatability, because the people who need to hear it deserve it said plainly. We talk about red flags constantly. We produce content about red flags. We make checklists and infographics, and we teach women and girls to identify them and name them and move toward the exit. And that effort matters. I am not dismissing it. But we talk less carefully about the conditions that make red flags invisible. About what happens when a person has been raised in circumstances, economic, emotional, social, that have consistently taught them that safety is something you earn from another person's decision to provide it. That love looks like being chosen. That the right kind of devotion looks like the patient, steady disappearance of your own preferences until you have reorganized yourself entirely around the preferences of someone else. Richard Calloway did not succeed because Maya was naive. He succeeded because he had identified, with precision, the specific hunger that her specific history had created. And he fed it with such expertise and such patience that by the time the feeding became control, the structure of it was already load-bearing. The question we need to be asking is not why she stayed. The question that will prevent the next Richard Calloway is, what kind of world produces the specific kind of hunger he knew exactly how to find? What kind of world teaches a 20-year-old woman that the most powerful thing that can happen to her is being chosen by a man with resources, and then fails to teach her anything about what that choice might cost? That is the question I am building toward, every day, in a building 4 blocks from where his flagship club stood. I hope you'll think about it too. If you made it to the end of this story, I need you to know something. The fact that you stayed, for 2 hours, through all of it, through the parts that were uncomfortable and the parts that were devastating and the parts that required you to sit with something you maybe didn't want to sit with, that means something. It means you understand that some stories require more than a headline. That the truth of what happens to real people inside real systems takes time to tell properly, and that time is worth giving. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, at what point in this story did you know? What was the moment you saw it before Maya could name it? What was the detail that landed hardest for you? And if you have lived any version of any part of this, at any scale, in any form, I want you to know that this space is for that conversation. Every single one of those comments gets read. Every one of them matters. There is a question I have been sitting with since I first heard this story, and I want to put it to you. At what moment do you think Maya stopped being afraid, and started being strategic? Because I have my answer. But I want yours. If this story is sitting with you, if it is the kind of thing you think someone specific needs to hear, please share it with that person. You know who I mean. You thought of them already, probably somewhere around the 30-minute mark. Send it to them. Sometimes the right story finds someone at exactly the right moment, and you have no way of knowing in advance whether this is that moment for someone you love. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one arrives. I will see you then.